Hey writers, it's Megan Barnhart here, coming at you live from the Write with Megan Facebook page. And today I'm going to be talking about revising versus editing your writing, and when to do each one and what those terms mean. And my hope is that this will help you get started with revising and editing and make this very heady process a little bit more manageable. So I'm going to get started by sharing us in the Write with Megan Facebook group. This is open to all writers. I invite you to join if you're not there already. It's a great place to meet other writers, authors, bloggers, people writing for business, people writing just because they love it, and connect with them, get advice, writing tips, all kinds of fun stuff like that. So come on and join us there. Facebook groups Write with Megan. And if you're here watching live, let me know. Say hello. I'd love to chat with you. Okay, so we are shared. And if I miss your comment, it's just because there's a lag, but I always go back and look at comments. So if you ask me a question and I don't get to it live, I will circle back around. Hey, Wayne, good to see you. So revising, editing. All right, guys, it's very simple. I've got a visual for you. So here you go. This is the process of drafting your book. Okay? And then you end up with this. This is the process of editing your book. Ooh, so nice and smooth. Okay. So the challenge is that what revising is dumping out this container and looking through every bit of it to make sure that your cup is filled with the right stuff, right? So when you dip into that well of, and if anybody knows what this is, like you're the $1 million winner, right? Because I want to know what this well of creativity is and how to get access to it, right? But you've drafted, you've filled up your cup with all this great stuff, but it's pretty messy. And eventually you're going to edit and you're going to smooth it out and it's going to all fit in this container. But the challenge of revising is that you have to make sure the stuff that fits neatly into your container is the right stuff. So that's what we're going to chat about today. So that's hopefully enough of a distinction between revising and editing. Those terms definitely have some overlap. I'm not claiming they're entirely distinct, but I hope that helps as a way to start. So then what I want to talk about are 3 rules for successful revising and editing, and give you an overview of that and take some questions. So let me get my flour out of the way, because that is exactly what I would do, is spill flour all over my computer. Okay, so Dave, you nailed the first tip for success, because Dave says, when I first started writing, it was not helpful to try to do much editing as I went along. I had to save it for after I wrote the first draft. And that's exactly what I want to encourage you to do. So my first tip for success, of the 3 I'm going to talk about today, my first tip for success is don't do any revising or editing until you have a complete draft. And what I always think of is this notion of like a 5-year-old, an eager 5-year-old, and a responsible adult. And if you've read Recipe for Drafting, you've heard more about this. But your drafting mind is this eager 5-year-old. Just like, let's do this, let's splash in the bottle, let's go outside in the rain, let's do all the fun stuff. And your editing and revising mind is like a responsible adult. It's like, oh, we'll get mud on the, oh, you don't have the right shoes, oh, you know what, you don't want to catch cold. And the more you limit that free, exuberant 5-year-old, the sooner she's going to lose steam and just kind of sit in the corner and sulk. So really, unless you have that practice of compartmentalizing your editing versus your drafting down to a science, avoid doing any editing or revising until you've got a complete draft. Now, a complete draft, that's a challenge in and of itself. And again, Recipe for Drafting kind of walks you through what a complete draft usually looks like. This is not an exact science. It is a techne. It is a craft. But it's there are definitely some rules and like ingredients. There you go. That's the word, ingredients that will let you know you've got a complete draft. So that's the first tip for success. Ooh, I've got some new people joining. Hello, Cecilia. Hello, Sapphire. Hello, Anne. Ooh, some of my favorite writers from Write with Megan are here. Wayne says, fantasy is never done. Yes, if you're writing worlds and worlds and words. All right, so that's your first success tip when it comes to revising and editing. Don't try to do either one until you have what feels like a complete draft. All right, the second rule, their second tip for success rather, is to edit last, right? So that visual of, clearing off the flour, making everything fit nicely into that measuring cup, that's editing. Ideally, you will be working with a professional editor, and before you do that, you're going to do an edit yourself to clean things up the best that you can. So I'm jumping to this last step because the revising is a little more complicated. So I'm jumping to editing, and then I'm going to come back and talk about revising. So when you are editing, this is where you're looking at things like word count. How are you making all your creativity that's now overflowing? How are you making it fit into that container? You're looking at word count. You're looking at awkward sentences. You're looking at unintentional repetition. Maybe there are sentences you can cut. Maybe there are whole scenes or chapters you can cut. And you're checking yourself for grammar and mechanics. So hopefully you can hear from that why it doesn't make sense to edit before you revise. And no, I have not really defined what revising means yet, except to say it's complicated. But what you'll be doing when you revise is reworking the writing itself. So it doesn't make sense to edit before you revise, because that's like painting your walls before you've put the insulation in or before you've reinforced them, right? So you want to make sure that you're doing things in the order that saves you from doing more work than you have to. And that means leaving editing for last. So this can be a real challenge. If you are somebody who can't stand errors, this is going to be your big challenge in writing. This is going to be the habit you have to build. Okay, how do I make it okay that I get into a page of writing and I see those little red squiggly lines all over the place that tell me I've got misspellings or typos, or, I invented weird words. What can I do to train myself not to go back and edit those? And it doesn't have to be a perfect system, it doesn't mean you never, when you open your draft, find a word and right click on it and take Google's suggestion for how to change it or word suggestion for how to change it. But it means that you cultivate a practice of not sweating the small stuff before it's time. Eventually, you're going to want to go wild on, looking for words that are not the right words, or words that are misspelled, or all those little fiddly bits, all those fiddly details. Yeah, eventually you're going to want to go hog wild on them, but not until you're sure that the thing you're editing is the right thing. So let me know if that makes sense, to edit last, because you don't want to be polishing and painting things that aren't even sanded and finished. Hey, Marina. Hey, Sarah. Good to see you guys. Okay, so let me know, does that make sense? Save editing for last. This is the place, see, I've got flour all over me. This is the place where you're making sure that everything is correct and that it fits and that it's as tight as it can be. Okay, so now let's come back to revising. This is your third tip for success. The first tip was don't revise or edit until you've got a complete draft. The second tip was save your editing for last. So the third tip for success is to break up your revising into different stages and move from big to small. The term revising, really it just means to look again at something. And if you're British, it means to study for a test. That always threw me, when people would say, oh, I'm revising for a test. And I'm thinking, you're rewriting? No, that means the same thing as reviewing, if you look at the Latin roots. But when you are revising, you are going back through what you've already written and you are attempting to make it better. And that is the most ill-defined writing task ever, right? You're like, if I could have made it better, I would have made it better. Like this was the best I could make it. What do you mean, Megan, make it better? But the good news is this is not actually amorphous, because think about everything you know. You know about story structure, right? So you can go back and make sure you have a plot. Do you have a conflict? Is your character working towards something, right? You can go back and look at the descriptions you have and ask, are they interesting? Do they grab readers? You can look at how you're using shows and tells. There are all of these different components of writing a story that you actually know about. And you can go through your story and ask yourself questions. And this is where your responsible adult is super helpful, because while you were drafting, your 5-year-old was like, yeah, and then there's this dragon and then this stuff happens and a giant apple explodes and it's filled with rainbows. That's what happens in my brain anyway. And then your rational adult comes back and is like, oh yes, and these rainbows could actually be the symbol of the kingdom. And so then when I go back to chapter 4, I'm going to plant that seed and let people know what the rainbows represent, right? And you get to do that kind of critical thinking. So the very frustrating thing about revising is that it covers everything from, do you have a conflict and do you have believable characters, to is your setting consistent, to did you use an interesting word there? All of that, that's the frustration of revising. But the opportunity of revising is that it covers all of that stuff. So to set yourself up, this third tip is really, really the key to successful revising. Because if you come in from this point of view, I'm going to break up my revising into different stages. I'm just going to go like slow and steady, one thing at a time, and move from big pieces to small pieces. That means you have the opportunity to make your story better in all of these ways, from the plot and the pacing to the consistency of the setting, to the character arcs and growth, to, like what color shoes would she be wearing and why, and what would that represent? Like, you get a chance to go back and think critically and think deliberately about all those pieces of your story and make your story the best it possibly can be. Right? And the idea of moving from big to small is, again, you don't want to polish something before you know it's right. And I feel like the best analogy for this is thinking about remodeling a home, right? So you buy this home and you're like, oh, there's some problems with it, but it's a good home. It's got good bones, as they say. And when you were looking at this home, there was this wallpaper in the hallway, and you're like, oh, that is the ugliest wallpaper. It has got to go. So as soon as you sign the paperwork, you get in there with a steamer and a scraper and you take down that hideously ugly wallpaper, and then you prime the walls and you paint them this beautiful color, your favorite color in the world. And you're standing and you're looking at these walls and you're like, this is so gorgeous. And then your architect comes up and he's like, oh, you said you wanted that open concept floor plan. We're knocking down these walls. And you're like, all those hours I spent steaming and scraping. You guys, if you've ever taken off wallpaper, this is like the worst. Steaming and scraping and sanding and priming and putting putty in, or, all those different details, only to find you have to knock down the wall. Okay, so that's why you want to move from biggest to smallest. So let me come back through and look at some of your comments. Sarah says, what does revising mean? This is the $1 million question, Sarah. Revising means adding to, rewriting, deleting, and changing your writing in order to make it better. It definitely has some overlaps with editing, because in both cases you might do things like take out repetition or choose a better word. But revising is not about, is it right or wrong? Editing covers a lot more of, is it right or wrong? Is that right for this genre? Does that belong in this genre? Is that right for this character? Is that grammatically correct? Is that stylistically correct? Revising is all that amorphous stuff about making it better that only you know as the author. And you can certainly get feedback and help. I mean, getting feedback from beta readers and then revising based on their feedback is really powerful. But Sarah, it's not an easy question to answer, but it means creating new drafts, right? You start with a first draft with hopefully a very rough draft to just get the idea out. Who is it? Who's the author who says your first draft is basically you telling yourself the story? I want to say it's Terry Pratchett, but I may be totally wrong. But I love Terry Pratchett, so I'm happy to just attribute that saying to him. Let's go with Terry Pratchett. He's brilliant. I love him. Okay. So you draft, right? Eventually you're going to edit, which is you're going to clean things up and make sure it all fits nicely into this package that is your book. And in the middle, everything you're doing to rewrite, to take out scenes that don't belong, to change things, to like go, oh wait, this shouldn't be set on a pirate ship at all. This needs to be set on a space station. All of those changes you're making, all of those rewrites you're doing is revising. And it looks different for every author. It takes a long time. It takes way, just like remodeling a house, it takes way longer than we planned for. You're always over budget and over time, off your timeline when you revise. It's just the nature of the beast, because there's always more that you feel you can do. But the tip for success I'm giving you is to break it up into different stages. Just accept it's going to be a lot, break it up into different stages, do one thing at a time, and move from biggest to smallest. So that's revising in a nutshell. Hey, Amanda. Yes, when you, Ingrid is saying, it sounds like when you cut out big stuff, it could also be adding in stuff. And eventually it's going to be cutting out or adding or changing the small stuff, because maybe there's just, one moment or one glance between two characters that you decide you want to be different. You go, oh, if this scene unfolds where she looks at him this way, it means this. And if she looks at him that way, it means something completely different. So there's a lot that it covers. Dave says revising is also good for foreshadowing and symbolism and character building. Yeah, absolutely. Monica Leonel, whose books I highly recommend on both writing and marketing your books, has this really great analogy, metaphor, visual of drafting being like painting. And so your first draft, you just kind of do, oh gosh, this is going to break down because I don't really know about painting, but guys, sorry if this is wrong, but your first draft is like, oh, you put in the background, like there's the hills and there's some, stuff in the, at the bottom. Then you come through and you put in the people. Then you come through and you put the expressions on the people, and you're continually putting in more layers. So revising is also this really exciting opportunity, like Dave is saying, to add in all the cool stuff that you love reading in books. I was talking about, I gave this random example earlier of like an apple exploding and there's rainbows in it. And then you decide as the author, ooh, those rainbows are a symbol of something, and you go back and you put them in other places. But think about some of the books you've loved reading and something happens and you're like, oh, that's so significant because we know it's already been established that she really is afraid of horses. And, so we know that he's this evil guy because he gave her a horse. My examples are so weird and random, but hopefully that makes sense, that you can put in these layers. You can add symbolism, you can add motifs and themes and shape your characters' journeys. I like thinking of drafting as sculpting, because it's very tactile, right? And so first you get that rough shape of the head, then you come back and you add in the details and the texture and all of that cool stuff. So that's, revising in a nutshell. Ingrid says, what's a good balance between expository stuff versus dialogue? Oh my gosh, Ingrid, that is such a great question. And I'm going to have to do a whole other video on that, because you guys, I have so many suggestions for you regarding backstory. So I'm going to put a pin in that. And that might be the next topic I do, exposition. Balance not just with dialogue, but with other stuff, because man, there are some really simple things you can do to make your exposition a lot more effective and easier for you to write. Wayne is saying, hey, no telling my plot. Did I capture your story perfectly, Wayne? Oh, good, because at least somebody gets my weird examples. Okay. Awesome. These are great questions. And Ingrid, maybe check out Dave's response. He's giving you some good tips about pacing there. Oh yes, it was Terry Pratchett. Okay, good. Who said the first draft is just you telling yourself the story. Ingrid says, is it more productive to do things out of order, like hack away on a chapter out of order? I hate combing through from chapter 1 all the time. Oh yeah, so that's a really good thing for you to put in your author toolbox. It often happens that you read a draft of something and the first chapter is like super polished. It's like perfect. You read the first chapter and you're like, whoa, this book is amazing. And then you get to chapter 2 and all the rest, and you're like, wait, they were just in summer and now all of a sudden it's coming down in a blizzard, you know. And you realize that this author must have done exactly this. Every time she sat down to revise, she started at chapter 1 and really made that as good as she could, and then kind of lost steam. So Ingrid, the solution for that might be going out of order, but I think more importantly, the solution is what I was talking about, where you move from big to small. So instead of saying I'm going to take one chapter and I'm going to really polish it, you don't have to do the whole book in one sitting, but you look at these big topics. You're like, oh, I'm going to look at the plot overall and get that right for all the chapters. And again, you could say like, I'm going to do chapters 1 through 5 first and then 6 through 10. You can break it up. But if you break your revising tasks into these goals, like looking at the plot, looking at the pacing, and looking at, I've got a whole 7-point plan, you guys. But if you break it up that way, then you're less likely to get that issue of the first chapter is so polished and everything else is really rough. So I hope that makes sense. When he says, my second draft of my main got 7 new chapters just to the beginning of it. Nice. So you found some things that needed to be added in. Cool. So you're going to be adding, you know, some people go, oh, I don't want to revise because I don't want to lose anything. Guess what? This is not necessarily you're going to lose stuff. You might find more things you need to add. You might find things you need to switch around. If you're writing a series, you might find some chapters that you're going to keep, but they're going to go in book 2 instead of in book 1. So there's so much that can happen there. All right, so I mentioned I've got this 7-point plan. So this is actually the perfect time to tell you guys. I am doing a free webinar, Revising Secrets, I have to look up the title, Revising Secrets for a Killer Novel Without Killing Yourself. And this is all about how can you do this process of revising that I was just describing, where you take things one step at a time, where you avoid that problem that Ingrid was talking about, where it's like the first couple chapters are really nicely polished and perfectly revised, and then everything else just kind of crashes in an avalanche of chaos. So come join me for that. You can register at meganbarnhard.com/revise. I will put the link in the comments. It's going to be very casual, very low key. I'm going to be going over those 7 points that I kind of alluded to about how to tackle revising. I'm going to be giving you tips for how to do revising successfully, what kinds of things you need to cover, and how to approach it so that you don't find yourself like getting lost, getting frustrated, getting stuck, and just shoving your first draft in a drawer for the next 10 years because it's too hard to deal with. And I'm laughing as I'm saying that, but it's actually not funny because I've talked to writers who've said that. They're like, I wrote this draft years ago, and then I just got so lost in trying to revise it that I stuck it away. Has that happened to anybody? Have you had something you wrote and then you, in the process of trying to polish it, make it better, add to it or take from it, you just went, this is too much? Let me know. I'd love to know if that's happened to anybody here, because I've definitely heard that from writers. It's like it's too much to revise. So that's what I want to save you from, because the hope is you're going to go from your rough draft to a final finished published draft. And by published, I mean whatever you want. Maybe that means you self-publish it. Maybe it means it's published through a publisher. Maybe it means you make photocopies and give it out to everybody you know. But getting it out into the world is the goal. So head on over to meganbarnhard.com/revise and sign up to join me for that free webinar all about, I have to read my title again. Revising Secrets for a Killer Novel Without Killing Yourself. All right. And I will be covering some more revising topics in the coming weeks. I love that question about exposition and backstory versus dialogue and other stuff that's happening currently. So I think I will tackle that topic next. But I will put in the link to where you can register. Okay. Hopefully that worked. Okay, and keep putting your questions about revising into the comments. I always go back and reread comments after I do a live broadcast because invariably I miss them. So I apologize ahead of time for that, but I will go back and look at your comments and give you a response. So please keep listing your questions, and this will also tell me what other topics in revising and editing you would like for me to cover, and I will get those out as new video topics. Thanks so much, everybody, for watching, and as always, I wish you happy writing.